Faith begins where human sight reaches its limit. When Paul declared that we walk by faith and not by sight, he confronted the soul with a truth that overturns every natural instinct. Sight clings to the present, to what feels safe, to what can be measured. But faith clings to God, whose constancy remains even when every circumstance shifts. There are moments when our senses betray us, showing chaos, but hiding the quiet hand that governs all things. It is in that space between what we see and what God has promised that faith becomes our vision. John Bunyan would insist that the soul must learn to look beyond the veil of the visible and interpret life through Scripture rather than emotion. Faith does not ignore reality. It places reality beneath the sovereignty of the one who rules it. To walk by faith is to trust when sight trembles. As the soul reaches for certainty in what it sees, it discovers how blind it is to the eternal. And it is in this very tension that the greatest battle rises, trusting the invisible God when everything around seems too silent to sustain hope. Faith in Scripture never rises from comfort, but from the collision between God's unchanging word and the instability of the visible world. When Paul says we walk by faith, not by sight, he teaches that the soul must interpret reality not through the senses, but through divine revelation. Bunyan would insist that this is the foundation of the true Christian life. Walking by sight means letting circumstances become the lens through which the heart interprets truth. Sight reacts to the moment. Faith responds to eternity. Sight trembles at the storm. Faith trembles before God alone. Sight sees darkness and loses orientation. Faith knows that even the darkness is ruled by the Lord. Biblical faith is not optimistic feeling, but trust rooted in Scripture. It rests in God's character, even when the situation seems impossible. Bunyan taught that the soul governed by sight remains unstable because it demands earthly assurances that God never promised. Faith rests not on clarity of circumstances, but on clarity of God. Sight sees the giant and collapses. Faith sees God above the giant. Sight sees the Red Sea and declares that there is no path. Faith remembers that seas have opened before. Sight clings to the immediate and therefore lives anxious. Faith clings to the eternal and therefore finds rest even in chaos. Hebrews calls faith the conviction of things not seen. Bunyan understood this to mean that the soul must embrace heavenly reality with more confidence than earthly appearance. Faith sees clearly what the natural eye dismisses as distant or irrelevant. Faith believes the unseen because it trusts the one who speaks. Walking by faith does not deny suffering. It places suffering under God's rule. Sight despairs when time delays. Faith knows God never delays. He fulfills every purpose at the perfect moment. Sight interprets waiting as abandonment. Faith interprets waiting as formation. Sight demands to understand before obeying. Faith obeys because it trusts the one who commands. Bunyan believed obedience is the clearest proof of faith, for only those who see the invisible will walk forward when certainty feels absent. Faith does not require the path to be illuminated before taking the step. Sight measures life by human strength. Faith measures life by divine sovereignty. Sight laments weakness. Faith sees that God perfects his power in weakness. Sight sees impossibility. Faith remembers that the Creator is not limited by human inability. When sight ends, faith begins its work. True faith is born not from self-confidence, but from dependence. Bunyan taught that the soul only walks by faith when it confesses its inability to sustain itself. Faith leans not on understanding, but on promise. Faith abandons the pride that insists on seeing before believing. Sight judges reality by surface impressions. It sees partially and concludes hastily. Paul commands believers not to fix their eyes on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Faith pierces superficial layers and holds to the God who works beyond human reach. Faith sees God where sight sees emptiness. Sight is confused by the unpredictability of life. Faith rests in the unchanging God. Seasons shift, emotions fluctuate, doors open and close, but the character of God remains the same. Faith anchors itself in this stability, refusing to be shaped by the instability of circumstances. Faith does not need favorable conditions to survive. It is sustained by the Spirit and strengthened by the Word. Bunyan taught that faith feeds on the promises of God as the body feeds on bread. Without nourishment from Scripture, the soul becomes dominated by sight, which never sees far enough. Walking by faith requires resisting the deceptive conclusions of the heart. Sight often arises from emotion rather than truth. Faith disciplines the inner world and commands feelings to submit to revelation. Faith is not governed by sensation, but by Scripture. Sight demands that God comply with human logic. Faith acknowledges that God transcends human thought. Faith is not irrational, but greater than fallen reason. It does not silence the mind, but places it beneath the authority of God. Bunyan saw faith as the eye of the renewed soul. Walking by faith means embracing spiritual reality as ultimate. There is a kingdom above all kingdoms, shaping every moment. Sight sees tragedy. Faith sees process. Sight sees loss. Faith sees transformation. Faith interprets life through divine purpose rather than human perception. Faith acts. It does not wait to feel courage. It moves because God is present even when unseen. Sight demands confirmation. Faith demands commitment. Sight seeks security. Faith finds security in God alone. Faith is movement rooted in confidence, not circumstance. For Bunyan, faith is warfare. There are hours when sight screams louder than truth. In these moments, the soul must lift the sword of the Word and remind itself that God is faithful in all generations. Faith battles to remain anchored in what God has said rather than in what the eyes see. Sight trembles before death, but faith sees resurrection. Sight fears tomorrow, but faith trusts the God who already stands in tomorrow. Sight forgets who God is, faith remembers. Walking by faith means allowing eternity to shape every step taken in time. Sight sees only the present. Faith sees the purpose. Sight sees the threat. Faith sees the God who protects. Sight focuses on risk. Faith focuses on promise. This is why Paul says we walk by faith, because only faith gives the Christian the ability to cross the visible world without being shaped by it. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs hope. To walk by faith is to grant God's promise greater authority than the moment's impression. Bunyan would insist that the soul must bow to Scripture even when the heart interprets life through anxiety. Faith is not born from clarity of circumstances, but from clarity of who God is. Sight constantly asks why God does not reveal the entire path. Faith understands that the Lord reveals each step as the soul matures in obedience. Israel received manna for the day, not for the week. Likewise, God grants guidance for today, not for control of tomorrow. Faith rests in this rhythm. Sight depends on visible progress. If nothing seems to change, it concludes that God is inactive. Faith relies not on movement, but on divine character. God works in silence, shaping the soul precisely when it feels immobile. Faith sees purpose where sight sees stagnation. Bunyan taught that faith does not see less than sight, it sees more. Faith perceives the unseen, the eternal, the divine intention behind events. Sight analyzes facts. Faith interprets them through God. Sight gathers information. Faith discerns meaning through the Spirit who reveals. Sight judges God's love by the absence of pain. Faith judges God's love by the cross. Sight demands immediate answers. Faith embraces mystery, trusting the God who moves in depths human reason cannot reach. Faith welcomes divine silence as part of heaven's instruction. Paul's declaration that we walk by faith signals an ongoing journey. Faith is not a single leap, but repeated steps, daily and often painful. Bunyan saw faith as a habit formed through endurance, trusting even when wounded, obeying even when weary, holding firm even when the path is unclear. Walking by faith does not mean the absence of fear, but the submission of fear to truth. Sight exaggerates threats. Faith reduces them to the scale of God's sovereignty. Faith does not deny danger, but places it within divine boundaries. Faith reframes chaos in the light of eternity. Sight waits for results before acting. Faith acts before results appear. This reversal is what forms the Christian soul. Faith teaches dependence rather than understanding. Bunyan believed that God leads his people through terrain where only faith can sustain them. Sight fears the future because it sees uncertainty. Faith embraces the future because it sees promise. Faith is not naive. It is anchored in a God who has already seen the end from the beginning. Faith does not walk in total darkness, but in the light of God's omniscience. Sight interprets events as though God were absent. Faith interprets them by remembering that God has never abandoned his people in any generation. Bunyan urged believers to preach to their own souls, reminding themselves that the God of the ancients is the God of today. Sight demands signs. Faith rests in Scripture. If God has spoken, that is enough. Sight says if, faith says God said. Faith depends on divine promise, not visible confirmation. Walking by faith means living on God's revelation rather than the moment's emotion. Sight stumbles over delays and closed doors. Faith understands that God uses waiting to refine desires and strengthen convictions. Bunyan believed that what sight calls delay is often God's method of aligning the heart with his will. Faith sees formation where sight sees frustration. Sight treats the present moment as final. Faith knows the present is only a fragment. Sight sees immediate impact. Faith sees eternal value. Faith perseveres when sight gives up, because it is driven not by outcomes, but by God's purposes woven through time. Sight reveres human power. Faith reveres divine sovereignty. Sight fears earthly authorities. Faith fears God alone. Bunyan taught that the soul that fears God loses fear of everything else, because it recognizes that nothing escapes the Lord's rule. Sight tries to interpret God through circumstances. Faith interprets circumstances through God. Sight bends Scripture to match experience. Faith bends experience to match Scripture. This conflict is the daily battlefield of the Christian heart, where faith must triumph. Sight clings to the visible for security. Faith breaks this illusion and clings to the invisible eternal. The unseen is not vague. It is more solid than the seen. Sight trusts what can be destroyed. Faith trusts what can never change. Faith finds certainty where sight finds fragility. Sight trembles when control slips away. Faith understands control was never ours. Faith releases what sight tries to hold and finds peace in surrender. Faith is not resignation, but confident submission to God's wisdom, which governs every detail without error. Sight sees limits. Faith sees God. This is why Paul declares that the Christian walks by faith, because only faith enables the believer to pass through the visible world without being shaped by it, living under the rule of the invisible, eternal, and infinitely faithful God. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs hope. Faith calls us to fix our eyes on God, even when everything around us feels uncertain. Bunyan would say the soul becomes steady only when it trusts Scripture more than the shifting impressions of the heart. Faith is the light that remains when sight grows dim. The believer who walks by faith is no longer governed by the tides of circumstance. Such a soul understands that the unseen is more solid than the seen, and that God's promise outweighs every contradiction. This quiet conviction becomes strength when sight provides none. Walking by faith means surrendering the control we never possessed. It means admitting that sight cannot see far enough, and that only God knows the end from the beginning. Faith embraces this truth with humility and turns each step into deliberate dependence. Sight reacts to the world. Faith responds to the God who speaks. Sight measures life by events. Faith measures life by promises. This shift is what shapes the Christian heart, enabling it to endure hardships that would otherwise feel unbearable to the natural mind. In the end, to walk by faith and not by sight is to let the eternal guide your steps in a world obsessed with the temporary. It is allowing the invisible God to become more real than everything visible, and in that certainty, the soul finally finds rest. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs hope.